Okay, I will do the introduction. Okay, hello and good morning and happy Hanukkah to all. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. As we approach each holiday, the Adult Education Committee of B'nai Yeshurun seeks programming that is meaningful and inspirational to add new perspectives and kavanot as we celebrate. This Hanukkah, we are very fortunate to welcome renowned Tanakh scholar Yael Leibowitz. Yael has previously taught at Ramaz and at Yeshiva University Stern College and has lectured widely. She recently made Aliyah with her family and currently teaches at Matan, continues to lecture more broadly, and is in the midst of preparing a new book to be published through Koren on Ezra and Nehemiah. Sounds fascinating. Yael has a real gift in presenting Tanakh narratives in a way that is relatable and exciting, and we look forward to learning with her today what it means to be a modern Maccabee. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Yael Leibowitz.
Thank you so much, Aviva. And thank you for having me. I don't know, I'm not seeing that many familiar faces from our days back in Teaneck, but it was our old stomping ground 20 years ago. So it's always nice to sort of be back a little bit. So I will start with a short little anecdote. When we first made Aliyah, that's an old bio, Aviva, so it's not so recent anymore. We made Aliyah it was 10 years ago, actually. It was 10 Hanukkahs ago. No, it's totally fine. I'm just saying my anecdote is from like a while back, which sort of got me thinking about this topic. My daughter was 2.5 at that point, and I remember I went, we sent her to the Gan nearby, the Datilu Umi Gan. And it was my first Gan Hanukkah party. And we sit there and we get, there's like all these like adorable little munchkin children, and they have their crowns with their Chanukkiot on their heads. And they start singing songs that I certainly, growing up in America, didn't grow up with these sort of cultural Israeli Hanukkah songs, right? We grew up with Al Hanisim, we grew up with Ma'uz Tzor. And one of the things, we were watching this little Gan show, and it was adorable. And they start singing, you have it on your source sheets, this very first song. And the words, you have the translation right underneath. It says, Anu nosim lapidim balelot afelim, right? It's talking about the Maccabees, that they're carrying torches in the dark night. And it's describing how the path is sort of shining beneath their feet as they're carrying those lapidim. Zorchim hashvilim mitachat raglinu, mi asher lev hatzamer laor, yisa et einav libo eleinu laor viavo, right? It's talking about sort of anyone who has the sort of strength and the desire should be joining this fight. I'm paraphrasing very, very roughly. And then the part that sort of struck me when I was watching these adorable little frum kids is they start chanting Nes lo kara lanu pach shemen bam'ara lo matzanu, right? Which is the sort of thrust of the song, and it's a phrase that's thrown around a lot in Israel, which is, right, no miracle happened to us, right? No cruse of oil did we find. So I'm sitting there this Gan part and thinking to myself, like, well, that's odd. Why is my daughter singing that no miracle happened to her? And actually sort of got me thinking and looking more into the Hanukkah songs that are popular in Israeli, both religious and non-religious culture, that were primarily written during the years of the early Zionist movement, or certainly many of them were. And it sort of got me thinking a little bit about what Hanukkah meant and what the Maccabim meant for the early Zionists, because one of the things that's really, really interesting that we find when we look at the history of early Zionism is that the Hanukkah story, and particularly the Maccabim, took on this sort of very prominent significance in the collective imagination of the early Zionist movement. So you would have, if there were meetings of Zionist leaders, it would happen specifically on Hanukkah. The names of clubs were named after different people, different members of the Maccabee family and Maccabee in general. And it sort of took on this life of its own. And we don't have to look past really that first source that you have there on your sheets. Theodore Herzl, he writes in 1896, he says, "And what glory awaits those who fight unselfishly for the cause? Right? Therefore, I believe that a wondrous generation of Jews will spring into existence." And his focus of this idea of a revived Jewish national entity, he says, the Maccabees will rise again. Let me repeat once more my opening words. The Jews who wish for a state will have it. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our homes. The world will be freed by our liberty, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness, and whatever we attempt there to accomplish for our own welfare will react powerfully and beneficially for the good of humanity. So Herzl's dream, which we're all really familiar with, is the sort of, I would say, historical precedent or the paradigm after which he models this vision for a renewed Jewish state are the Maccabees, right? The Maccabees will rise again and they will once again achieve national independence for the Jewish people. And it's interesting, actually, particularly that Hanukkah in many ways was a holiday that was celebrated by the early Zionists. It's particularly interesting in contrast to what we know to be true about so many of the other holidays, right? So many of the early Zionists there was an attempt to suppress so much of what they associated with religion and with exile and with the diaspora, helpless Jew that went like sheep to the slaughter through, and I'm not even talking, right, this is pre-Holocaust. We're talking about even just the years of pogroms and being this sort of passive people unable to fight back and protect themselves. And so a lot of the anger and resentment about the diaspora and the exile experience, of course, was channeled against religion, which was believed to be, one of the things that weakened the Jewish people during that experience. And so a lot of the religious holidays were suppressed. The Hanukkah, right? And actually, there were the couple of Jewish holidays that sort of remained as part of the Zionist culture, so to speak, were the holidays that were able to be associated less with religion, less with God, and more with agriculture. And so, for example, Tu B'Shvat continued to be celebrated, and even Shavuot took on a sort of different character, or we might even argue, right, a sort of more authentically biblical character than the Shavuot that we celebrate of Matan Torah. But Hanukkah in particular took on this really central place in Zionist thought and in Zionist culture. And I'm going to read to you just a couple of, and again, I'm really sort of, I'm not delving into the nuances, right? It goes without saying, I'm just going to sort of say this as as part of the intro, it goes without saying that within the early Zionist movement, there were lots of nuances and lots of different sectors within the movement. And so what I'm doing here is really an unfair sort of generalization. But what we're looking at, or at least trying to look at initially at the very least, is sort of this trend where the Hashmonaim, the Maccabim, were valorized, where they were sort of put on a pedestal, and where all other models of religious Jews were sort of pushed aside, or again, sort of consciously suppressed. So if you look there in source 2, for example, and I just took lots, sort of various quotes from that time period. Source 2, this was published in Hatzvi in 1893. It says, "We recite in that prayer," right? They're talking about the liturgy of Hanukkah. "You fought, you judged, you avenged, you delivered. But who brought all these things? Who did all this? Who was the emissary of the Lord? Who was the man of battle? Where is Judah the Maccabee who defended his brothers with his sword and his bow? Judah the Maccabee might as well have never have existed for all his mention in this prayer." Right? So what's the author here reacting to? You can take yourselves off soon. You can make it interactive here. What's the author reacting to here?
Al-Hanisim.
Al-Hanisim, and particularly that in Al-Hanisim, who gets completely ignored?
Judah the Maccabee.
Right? And it's sort of talking about this idea. It's focusing as if God brought the victory upon the Jewish people. But he's saying, right, the author is pushing back and saying, why are we giving God the credit when Yehuda Maccabee is the one that picked up his sword and fought for us? Now, I'll read you another example. This is from a little bit later, 1911. It says, "Those responsible were the passive Torah bearers who carried the name of God on their lips, but whose hearts were far from every feeling of freedom and liberty." Okay, this is an early Zionist thinker who's really pushing back at what we idealize, right? We talk a lot about dying al Kiddush Hashem. We talk about martyrdom. We talk about the Chana b'Shivat Baneha. And this thinker is saying, why are we valorizing that? Why are we glorifying dying passively at the hands of oppressors instead of fighting back, right? He says, martyrs are evoked at times of weakness. Heroes are emulated at a time of courage and action. The Hasmoneans did not make do with prayers. The Biryonim, he's fast forwarding now to the period of Bar Kokhba, did not expect miracles. They shed their blood for people's freedom. Meron or Modi'in, which is stronger, right? He's taking the two sort of the center of the Hasmonean rebellion and then the center later on during the Roman period of this sort of revival of Torah learning. He says, which is stronger? Which will triumph? Which will determine the course of our current history? Okay. And so again, I'm certainly oversimplifying, and just as a point of contrast, I brought, for example, Burl Katznelson, who was also one of the, a little bit later on, but one of the earlier Zionist thinkers, and he does push back at what he understood to be this sort of extreme approach of suppressing religion. And he argues, particularly when it was actually an interesting case having to do with pig farmers in Israel. And he uses, again, an example from the Hanukkah period, or a story associated at the very least with the story of Hanukkah. And he says, how shall we tell our children about the selfless devotion of Hannah and her 7 sons if for the very cause of which they were killed has no meaning in our own way of life? Right? So again, there was certainly, I would say, the overall trend, which is, this is not news to anyone here, was to sort of suppress any religious stirrings and suppress the idea that God's hand is what was working in history. And in that place, bring to the fore really the idealization of the model of the Maccabees, people that took up sword and fought against their oppressors and refused to say or refused to accept a lack of independence and refused to be the victims. Okay, so that was a model that was really, really important. Now, what's interesting is that if we jump down to some of the early ancient Jewish thinkers, okay, we see sort of another interesting thing. If we're going to sort of summarize and say that the Maccabees, or excuse me, the early Zionists tried to play down the miracle of the oil. So what's interesting is that we might assume, right, if I said to you, so the early Zionists tried to play down the miracle of the oil, but we hear about the oil all over, right? The Jews, from the miracle of the oil and on, were talking about it. Right? That would be our assumption. But what's interesting is that if we actually trace ancient Jewish writings up until the period of the Talmud Bavli, they too don't really talk that much or at all about the miracle of the oil. Okay, so I'm going to start with source 7. Source 7 is the first book of Maccabees. We know that there was the first, the second, and then also the third, which we're going to sort of put into a separate category. But the first and second book of Maccabees were written relatively soon after independence was gained. And here in the first source, it says this is how they explain the what we would call the sort of roots of the holiday of Hanukkah. Okay, it says source 7. It says early in the morning on the 25th day of the month, which is the month of Kislev in the 148th year, they rose and offered sacrifices as the law directs on the new altar of the burnt offering that they had built. At the very season and on the very day that the Gentiles had profaned it, it was dedicated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals. Okay, it's probably supposed to be flutes. So here, right, they're focusing on the fact that what was regained was the ability to go into the Mikdash and purify it. And then they go on, and the author says, so they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days and joyfully offered burnt offerings. Then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at the season, the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Kislev. Okay, so what's missing in that paragraph from the first book of Maccabees, talking about the holiday of Hanukkah and why we celebrate it? Same thing that my daughter was chanting in Gan, right? There's no mention, Nes lo haya lanu pach shemen, right? There was no pach shemen. There was no miracle of the flask of the oil, or at the very least, it doesn't seem to have been important to the author of the first book of Maccabees. What he's focusing on is what? What's his focus? What are we celebrating when we celebrate Hanukkah?
Victory.
We're celebrating the victory and the
rededication of the Mizbeach.
Correct, right? The rededication. I'm really happy, Alana, you said the Mizbeach, right? Because it's the temple, but it's in particular the ability once again to bring korbanot in this purified space of the temple. Now, by the way, why he doesn't explain, but why would we therefore celebrate 8 days?
Maybe similar to the Chanukah HaMikdash and the Mishkan.
Correct. That's exactly it, right? The Chanukah HaMikdash, when the first Beit HaMikdash was built, and the second was also 8 days long. And so fittingly, when we're rededicating the Mikdash, so too it's going to be 8 days long. Okay, that's the first book of Maccabees. Fast forward a tiny bit to the second book of Maccabees, and they say as follows: it happened that on the same day on which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners, the purification of the sanctuary took place. That is, on the 25th day of the same month, which was Kislev. And now again, they go on, right? We know it was always an 8-day holiday, but they say they celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing, therefore carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches and also fronds of palm. They offered hymns of thanksgiving to him who had given success to the purifying of his own holy place. They decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole nation of the Jews should observe these days every year. Again, right? There's the purification of the temple, there's the celebration, but there's no mention of the miracle of the oil. Okay? It's missing also, if you fast forward about 200 years to the first century CE, excuse me, in Josephus's writings. We also have no mention. I'm going to jump to the very, very end of that paragraph. Right? He's talking also about the revival of the customs and how after a long period in which they weren't able to worship and they had no freedom of worship, they were able to return to the Mikdash and celebrate. And in those last bolded lines, it says, and from that time to this, we celebrate this festival and call it lights. Right now, lights. So now we're getting, okay, so maybe we're getting there. Maybe we're getting to the miracle of the oil. But then he explains, I suppose the reason was because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us, and that thence was the name given to the festival. So he explains the miracle of lights, that because, right, the sort of this metaphorical or allegorical light that was rekindled the spirit of the Jewish people. That's it. Okay, if you look in Al-Hanisim, if you look in the liturgies of the Hanukkah that was written during the earlier periods, no mention at all. The earliest mention that we have of the miracle of the Pach HaShemen doesn't appear until the period of the Talmud Bavli. Okay, I'm going to read to you there from the bolded lines. It's answering the question, my Hanukkah, right? Why do we have this holiday of Hanukkah? And it says in the bolded, "Kshenichnesu Yevanim lehechal, tim'u kol hashmanim shebehechal, ukshegavra malchut beit Chashmona'i v'nitzchum, בדקו ולא מצאו אלא פח אחד של שמן שהיה מונח בחותמו של כהן גדול ולא היה בו אלא להדליק יום אחד. נעשה בו נס והדליקו ממנו 8 ימים. בשנה אחרת קבעום ועשאום ימים טובים להלל והודאה. Okay, so finally in the Bavli, we find the story that we've all been waiting for. Okay, now, tell me what your question is. Or what question is sort of surfacing as you're reading through the ancient sources all the way up to the period of the Talmud Bavli? There should be a couple of questions, right?
Well, it's taken about 700 or 800 years for anyone to mention the nace of the Shemen. And it's coming at a much later contemporary source.
Right. It's coming much later, certainly not by eyewitness accounts, by any stretch of the imagination. And it's not even coming in the next century or 2 or 3, right? So what question sort of does that lead to? And again, we're going to
Did it actually happen?
That's the obvious question, right? Did it actually happen? My approach in general when we have questions like that is less to ask, did it actually happen? And more, and again, I'm not sort of, or maybe you could argue I'm skirting the question, but I'm sort of putting less the question, did it actually happen? We don't necessarily question the historicity of something when we're trying to understand historical trends. The question that I like to focus on more is why did this aspect of the event, or why did this memory begin to take such an important place in, again, what we sort of called before the collective imagination of the Jewish people? Okay, let's imagine there was a tradition dating back to that time. For whatever reason, it was ignored for hundreds of years. And then suddenly in the period of Talmud Bavli, all of a sudden, rather than talking about, right, my Chanukah, it doesn't mention what they mention in the writings about the victory necessarily of Matityahu. It mentions it as of the Chashmonaim. That's the historical backdrop for the miracle, but the focus is the miracle of the oil lasting for 8 days. It also doesn't necessarily focus on the repurification of the temple complex itself, right? It sort of focuses on this one kli from the Mikdash that was able to burn for 8 days. And because that was able to burn for 8 days, that's why we celebrate for 8 days, completely ignoring the notion, like you mentioned before, Alana, of the Chanukah HaMikdash wholesale. Right? So what I want to try to do is sort of try to make sense, again, rather than asking who's right and who had it right and whose version is more historically accurate, because I think those questions, A, are impossible to answer, and B, personally to me, are less interesting than asking what was happening at these different periods in history that led the people who were writing the story to tell the story the way they did, right? History, we know there's no such thing as an objective historical account, right? History at the end of the day is how we choose to tell the story, what we choose to remember from history, which elements we choose to conspicuously ignore, and which elements we draw into high relief. Right? I don't have to tell anyone who reads newspapers today and is watching what's happening in this country that narratives and how you tell a story is ultimately what shapes people's perception. Okay, so what I want to focus on really is what was happening. So if we go back just for a moment to the period really when the Talmud Bavli was being written, it was being written at a very, very different period than, for example, the books of the Maccabees. The books of the Maccabees were being written when the Jews were on a high, when they had just regained independence, where national pride was the most important element they wanted not only to focus on, but to engender within the Jewish people. The Talmud Bavli is being written outside of the land of Israel, after, not only outside the land of Israel, but after a series of failed Jewish revolts against the Romans that not only ended in tremendous amount of slaughter of Jewish people, but ended perhaps even more importantly after the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s of the Common Era, ended with the complete sort of decimation of Jerusalem as a capital and the inability of the Jews to even return and to have any access to there. So one of the trends, and this is not necessarily specific to Hanukkah, but something that scholars have noted in the sort of broader corpus of the Talmudic literature, is a focus really on pacifism, is a downplaying of messianic sort of desires for revolt and for overthrow of the overlords, so to speak, and more a trend towards pacifism, more a trend towards gaining strength through the learning of Torah, more a movement towards the suppression of these revolutionary stirrings, and more a sense of, here's how, given the current scenario that we find ourselves in, we are going to make the best of that situation. Okay, and that's something that I think is really, really important. So the story, or the thrust of the story of Hanukkah, that was so powerful and so important in the books, for example, of the Maccabees, and even you could argue, perhaps even in the days of Josephus, is something that Chazal very, very intentionally played down. But at the same time, when you're withdrawing meaning from a holiday, then what do you also have to do simultaneously? If I'm saying Hanukkah is no longer about the ability of Jews
Give
to
it another meaning.
Correct, right? You have to fill that vacuum. You can't say, keep doing the ritual, even though I have now completely sucked the ritual dry of meaning, and I'm no longer focusing on all of those things the ritual once meant, but keep doing the ritual. What we need to do is then fill that void, fill that space with a renewed or with a reimagined meaning. Okay, so what we see the focus in the Gemara is this reimagined meaning. Now, the question that I really want to spend a couple of minutes on, though, is one of the cornerstones, we might argue, of Talmudic thought, or really of rabbinic thought wholesale. In many ways, Chazal reimagined what religion needs to look like in the absence of a temple, right? There's no longer 3 korbanot a day, so we're going to institute the concept of tefillah 3 times a day, connected the korbanot. There's no longer sacrifices, and so we're going to, or there's no longer a mikdash, and so we're going to figure out how to create a mikdash ma'at in our lives and the proper protocol we're going to have to enact when we want to approach that mikdash. What they essentially did was create a religion, or reimagine religion, that can exist outside of sacred space, that can exist outside of the land of Israel, that's not necessarily tethered to a mikdash, that's portable, that will transcend time, that can transcend space, and that can be a religion that can remain cohesive for Jews throughout the world and throughout the exile. But that being said, Chazal also understood and made it very, very clear that any I would say sort of new ideas that they were introducing was always rooted in and based on biblical precedents. And we know that just from learning any standard page of Gemara. But even in the ideas that they articulate, there's always a sense that what they're doing is not inventing, right? There's no ex nihilo. What they're doing is always just interpreting or expanding on biblical precedents that really can sort of then resonate in later generations. So what I want to do today for the next couple of minutes is look at the miracle that Chazal in the Gemara sort of design. And if I asked you to go back to what they write here, I'll open it up for you again. Go back to those couple of lines in the Gemara. There's 3 elements that I think are really, really important in the way, again, they tell their story. What are the 3 primary elements of the miracle itself? If we were going to sort of deconstruct that we're familiar with it, but now try to deconstruct it and break it down to its component parts. What do we have? What are we left with? And again, think when you're reading it, like, does it have to be told that way? right? When we're trying to deconstruct something, we're asking which details feel extraneous, and then we're going to have to understand why they're not in fact extraneous, why they're actually sort of germane to the very narrative that they're telling. כשנכנסו יוונים להיכל, טימאו כל השמנים, right, שבהיכל, כשגברה מלכות בית חשמונאי וניצחום, right, so again, that's not the focus, that's the backdrop, that's just the setting. בדקו ולא מצאו אלא פח אחד של שמן שהיה מונח בחותמו של כהן גדול. So the first element is what? They're sort of digging under the rubble, right? And the rubble has been building up since the years when the Mikdash was once pure. Remember those good old days when the Mikdash was pure and every flask of oil had the seal of the Kohen Gadol? So they're digging through the rubble and they find this one leftover flask. So that's the first element, right? Is that this sort of finding of something, retrieval of something that had been lost or something that had been hidden under the layers of history. And then it goes on, ולא היה בו אלא להדליק יום אחד, נעשה בו נס והדליקו ממנו 8 ימים. So again, we focus on the oil, but the miracle ultimately, the oil is only the fuel for what? The oil is the fuel for the fire. The fire is the miracle. The fact that the fire was burning for 8 days is ultimately the miracle. The fact that the medium didn't wear out is, of course, but the focus itself is on the ability of that fire to be burning for 8 days. And then it goes on, okay, so I'm going back, Alana, to something you said earlier. When we looked at the books of the Maccabees, the miracle was the reinstitution of which kli from the Mikdash? What do they focus on in all of the earlier accounts? Right. In all the earlier accounts, the miracle or the victory, right, that which symbolized the victory of over the Greeks was their ability to reinstitute sacrifices. Here, we're not even talking about sacrifices. We're focusing on something found, the ability for it to remain lit, but they're focusing suddenly on the Chanuki, on the menorah, which isn't even mentioned in any of the other sources. Nowhere else do we see that the big excitement was that they were able to finally light the menorah again. That doesn't even factor into any of the earlier discussions. So what I want to do now is just look at, perhaps, again, going back to this understanding that what Chazal are always doing is drawing from biblical precedents and understanding that what they were living through in their lives was sort of just an expansion of, or another iteration of, something that happened earlier in history. I want to look at those 3 elements, okay? The first one is to find something that had been hidden away. And one of the things that we notice if we start looking in Tanakh is that actually there are a number of times where something that had been hidden was suddenly discovered. The first, and I would say the most obvious parallel, is from the end of Melachim, the end of Sefer Melachim during the days of Yoshiyahu. So we're talking the mid 600s BCE. Okay, the last few decades right before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And one of the things that's interesting is Yoshiyahu, as you all know, is one of the last righteous Judean kings. And he made these sort of valiant efforts to try to restore Jerusalem to what it was, and to try to rid the country of its impurity, and to rid the country of all the Avodah Zarah and the pagan elements. And one of the things that happened while they were cleaning out the Beit HaMikdash during his reign, during this religious revival, so to speak, is there. It's right there on the tops of your first charts. It says, Sefer HaTorah, so it's Shaphan, Chilkiah Kohen, and Shaphan the Sofer were in the Beit HaMikdash cleaning it, and all of a sudden they said, whoa, Sefer HaTorah Matzati B'Veit Hashem. Okay, now again, we have to imagine how bad things have gotten if a Torah scroll is thrown under debris in the temple. Okay, that's just an example. That's just sort of reiterates how bad things have gotten. But it says B'Veit Hashem v'yitein Chilkiyahu et haSefer el Shaphan v'yikarehu, and Shaphan reads it, and then they bring it back to the Melech who then sends them to Cholda HaNeviah, and she decrees what she decrees based on the paragraph that the Sefer Torah was ostensibly open to. Okay, but what's important and what I think is really, really critical here is that there's a sense in many ways that when there's an attempt to almost regain what had been lost, or we might even say to sort of bridge the gap between an idealized past and a less ideal present, one of the ways in which the Tanakh seems to tell or speak about those efforts is through exactly this, finding something that had been hidden away from a bygone era and drawing it into the present, and in that way almost closing the gap between this imperfect present and the past. Okay, I'll give you another example. And I'm not going to be reading through all these in time because I know everybody has Hanukkah parties to prepare for, but they're on the sheet. So please at your own leisure, look through them, but I'll give you a couple more examples. We have, for example, in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, right? We know that Ezra and Nehemiah went back with the first wave of Jews in 539 after Cyrus's decree. We're talking BCE, 539 BCE. But by 522, the Mikdash still hadn't been built. They had laid the foundation and the cornerstone, but that was really it. And Zechariah, and one of the things, I'm jumping ahead, sorry. But Ezra, one of the things by the reign, yeah, I'm just confusing the two sources that I actually brought up. I'm going to go back 539 to go back to the land of Israel. And then that was in the days of Cyrus, and in the days of Darius, what we call Amei Haaretz, and we're not going to get into exactly who they were, but at sort of al regel achat, they were trying to thwart the efforts of the Judeans who were trying to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, and they send letters to the Persians, and they claim that the Judeans are not trying to rebuild their temple, they're actually trying to stage a revolt, and that you have to stop letting them build immediately. And so the building efforts were stopped, and they weren't actually able to continue rebuilding until, if you look in Ezra Perek Vav, that second box on your charts, it says, "Vishtakach ba'achmeta virta di b'madai medinta megillah chada l'chein right? Until they found, so the Judeans have their own response, and they say to the Persian kings, they say, no, we're telling you, Cyrus is the one, we're not doing this on our own accord. Cyrus is the one that gave us the permission to go back and rebuild. Go and look through the archives in Persia, and I'm telling you, you're going to find it. And lo and behold, the Persians go and they dig through the archives, and what do they find? This Megillah, this scroll from the days of Cyrus. And what that results in is then the King Darius then writing a letter to the Judeans and saying, you have my full permission to continue building. And not only do you have my full permission, you have my full support, and my monetary and my imperial support. And that is what enabled them to continue and to really finish the building of the Mikdash. Again, this digging up of something that had been buried, again, sort of, it's almost like you have these vicissitudes of history piling up, but you dig under those piles and you find that thing that enables you to bridge the gap, okay? Again, I'm not going to read through all the examples, but you have another example when they build the Beit HaMikdash, and they find they bring back the Aron that David had brought up to Yerushalayim in Perek Zayin of Shmuel that had really fallen out of use from the days when the Plishtim took it all the way back in Shmuel Aleph. Okay? You have, just to show how prominent this motif is, in the second book of Maccabees, we actually have another story about fire that had been hidden in earlier periods in history, that in the days of Nehemiah, he asked the priests to help him find that magical fire that had been concealed after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. And so again, this idea of something hidden being retrieved is something that really figures very prominently in Tanakh, certainly in later literature as well. And it's a way really of speaking about drawing from that past ideal and drawing it into the present. Okay, so that's the first element. The second element is fire. So without even looking at your source sheets, if I say to you fire, free associate, play broken telephone, what do you think of in Tanakh? Where does fire feature? Or you could cheat. Look at your source sheets. Right, look at the very first, or not the first time, but one of the first times, right? When Hashem is making the promise, or when Hashem is being koreit the brit with Avraham Avinu, he has this brit bein b'tarim. And how is the brit sealed? It says, "Vayi Hashem eshpa'av al hataya, v'hinei tanor ashan v'lapid ish asher avar bein hagzarim ha'eleh." Right? It's called Brit Bein Habtarim because they split the animals in half, put them on each side, and a lapid eish, this column of fire, walked between the pieces. That was God's way of communicating to Abraham. I am now sealing this Brit officially with you. Right? And that's not the only time God manifests as fire. If we look in Shemot Perek Gimel, Moshe is just wandering about herding Yitro's sheep, and all of a sudden he turns and he notices this strange sight. It says, "Vayar malach Hashem elav blabat eish mitoch hasneh." Right? He turns and he realizes the fire is burning, but it's not actually consuming the bush. And so he turns around to see what it is, and that's the first time God appears to Moshe Rabbeinu from this fire. So fire, And again, there's a lot of symbolism, which we're not going to get into right now, right? But when God manifests physically in this world, he manifests as this all-consuming fire. And it makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you think about it, fire is that which gives energy and that which gives warmth and that which enables us to cook food. But fire can also be dangerous if you broach too close, right? Think about the sons of Aharon. Think about the God's presence on Har Sinai, which wasn't fire, but it's that same idea that God's presence is so potent that it's also fatal. And so fire is that perfect sort of physical symbol for the presence of God. And that's why throughout the Midbar, if you look there in Shemot Perek Gimel, God walked Hashem holech lifneihem yoman ba'amud eish lanchotam haderech v'layla b'amud b'amud an lanchotam haderech v'layla b'amud eish throughout the Midbar. And again, remember the question that God was responding to when he started manifesting in these physical forms is Bnei Israel asking, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin? Right? Is God in fact in our midst? Is God's immanence something that we can see? And God appeared to them in fire. And we have the last one also, Vahi bashmorot haboker vayishkef Hashem machane Mitzrayim. God appeared there in Yud Daled as well. Okay? And so you have this drawing of something from the past. You have this reminder, what Chazal were saying, through the fire burning for 8 days, that despite the fact that it seems as if the fire cannot burn in this given scenario, not only can the fire burn, but the fire continues to burn. Right? The menorah almost replaced, in many ways, the Ner Tamid, so to speak. Right? The fire of the menorah became that reminder or that sort of that physical thing that ensured that God's presence still remained within the Jewish people. Okay? So the last question we have to ask is then why the menorah? Right? So why not have the fire burning consistently on the Mizbeach? Why do we have the menorah? So the menorah actually, while it was one of the kelim of the Mikdash, it was certainly not one of the central kelim when we look through Tanakh. The menorah becomes the most important kli if we look down in Sefer Zechariah, which is what I was confusing before when I was talking. Okay, Zechariah has a nivuah. Zechariah, I'm going back now again to the Persian period. We said that Cyrus gave the Jews the right to build in 539. In 522, the Mikdash still hadn't been built. It was still sort of just laying in disrepair and the foundations had been laid, but no one was actually, there was no, the momentum had slowed so significantly that it wasn't really happening. And Zechariah got a series of nivuot from God. One of the nivuot, he was prophesying in the year between 522 and 520. One of the nivuot that Zechariah gets, he sees this beautiful menorah that has various designs on it and it's lit. And Hashem says, right, he says, what do you see? And he says, Vayan, I'm going to read there in Pasuk Vav from that chart. It says, Vayan, Vayomer Elai Lemor, Ze Dvar Hashem El Zerubbabel Lemor. Okay, the message or the symbolism of the menorah is as follows. Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach ki im beruchi amar Hashem tzvakot. So Zechariah Hanavi, the symbolism of the menorah in the Second Temple period, begins on this note of the menorah symbolizes that there will be restitution, that everything the Jewish people are pining for will be restored, but it's not going to be restored through brute force. It is going to be restored through Ruach Hashem. Okay, which if we go back now to what we said about Chazal and the focus on Chazal in suppressing revolutionary stirrings, in suppressing the desire of the Jewish people throughout foreign empires to revolt against their hosts. So it makes perfect sense that their focus shifts from the Mizbeach and from the restoration of restoring korbanot, which was not possible anymore in Babylon, to a focus on the lighting of a menorah, which every Jewish household can put on their windowsill. And that menorah can be a reminder of, again, this fire of God, the fire, that constant fire of God that is a reminder of his presence in our homes, at the windows of our homes. And perhaps even more importantly, that the reality that we are living through will be solved. Things will work out, but we have to trust that God will work them out for us. It is not for us to take up arms and revolt. Okay. So again, if we sort of look, I mentioned at the beginning that the questions that I prefer to ask are not what actually happened, right? But rather, what was happening in history. I think that one of the things that's so fascinating is that if we start at the very beginning, the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, were fighting for freedom of religion. They were fighting for freedom of religion. They were fighting for independence in their homelands. And they were fighting to be able to be proud Jews. And when the war ended, that national pride is what they focused on, the national pride, and then the ability to return to the Mikdash and worship the way that they felt that they should rightly worship. And then if we move forward a little bit in history, we said that once Jews had to assume a more pacifistic stance because they really were powerless. And in order to survive and in order to prevent the slaughter and the defeats that they had experienced in the failed Jewish revolts, so then the holiday took on this alternative shift. And then Chazal spoke and shaped the narrative of our holiday in a way that could resonate with Jews in exile, that could link them to the past, that could infuse their present with meaning, and that could give them the ability to trust that God will continue to work in and through history, right? But then fast forward to the period of early Zionism, the early Zionists resented that pacifism and they resented that passivity. And they felt that the belief in God in many ways and the belief that God will figure it out for us had been the root of so many of the wrongs that the Jews had been, or so many of the wrongs, I would say, that the Jews had suffered over the thousands of years of exile. And so for the first time in 2 millennia, they wanted to erase the religious components of the holiday and bring back one component that the Hasmoneans spoke of. I think I'll just, I think that one of the, we talk about a lot of modern miracles, and I think you don't have to go past the headlines or things going around on WhatsApps and Facebook to see really in the darkest of times how many miracles are happening minute by minute. But I would say in the bigger picture, one of the things that I think is most inspiring and most amazing about being able to celebrate Hanukkah today is that for the first time in over 2,000 years, really close to 2,500 years, for the first time, we don't have to choose between narratives. This is the first time with the Jews back in a state of our own. It is the first time in over 2,000 years where we could hold proudly onto the idea of national pride and Jewish independence and the ability for Jews to fight back, and at the same time be able to hold on to the belief that God is engaged in history and that we can proudly wear our religion as well, and that the two are not only not mutually exclusive, but that when we utilize the two together, that's ultimately really what we're all about. I remember years ago, they have right down the block, actually in Modi'in, which for those of you that aren't familiar, Modi'in was believed to be the headquarters, or where the Maccabean, the Hasmonean revolt really started, was in the city of Modi'in. And they actually discovered an ancient shul, which they believed to be the most ancient, if not one of the most ancient shuls in Israel, discovered to date. And it's dated to the period of the Hasmoneans. There's evidence that it was actually from the period of the Maccabees. And every Friday night Hanukkah, there's a really beautiful minyan that davens down there, which is, I don't have to explain to you why, that's like one of the most exciting things that goes on here all year. But what I think really speaks to what I'm talking about is in the earlier years, when the Israeli Antiquities Authority was still working on the site, when they had already identified as an early Hasmonean site. So there was a minyan down there, and there weren't even lights yet. And there was a cop car. It was Friday night during Kabbalat Shabbat, and a cop car pulls up on the side of the road, and he sees and he stops and he comes over to ask, what's going on, what's happening. And someone from the minyan explained to him, this was a shul from the time of the Maccabee, and it's Hanukkah. And the cop says, hold on one second. And he goes back to his car, and he comes out and he puts a kippah on his head, and he joined them for Kabbalat Shabbat. And that was, it's become an urban legend, but I think the urban legend really speaks to everything that we're all about. I think that now more than ever, this idea, this ability to hold on so powerfully to our faith, simultaneously with the conviction that as Jewish people, we have the right to defend ourselves and to fight for our safety, again, is something that we have not been able to hold on simultaneously to in 2,000 years. And that in and of itself, for me personally, is the Hanukkah miracle. So I will end with two very, very quick, just little paragraphs also, again, from songs that the kids sing in Gan. It says, right there, source 11 at the end, right? So it's talking about how they're dressed up, if you picture it, right? Little kids in their outfits, and each one is dressed up like a little kad of oil, and each one it says, kad katan, kad katan. But the middle paragraph, it says, Gam kol yeled kat ya'amod kezeh hakad, umilev tamim tahor le'olam yashpia or, right? Which is ultimately, what we wish that every single one of our children who are dressed up as little flasks of oil with their pure hearts can be able to spread light in this world. That's all we've ever wanted. That's all we've ever been fighting for. And I'll finish with the last few lines, which again, for those of you who are getting the WhatsApps from on this end of the ocean, this is, I think, perhaps the paragraph that is going around, being sent around and being put on cupcakes and being put up more than any other paragraph, because I think it speaks really to what the young, not even so young, what all of the soldiers in Gaza are trying to do as we speak and we sit comfortably at our tables, is they are in the midst of the darkest place in the world. And that last paragraph, it says, Banu choshech legaresh, biyadenu or va'esh. We have come to dispel the darkness, and in our hands we have light and we have fire. Kol echad hu or katan, right? Each one of us is this small little light. Vikulanu or etan, but together, right? We burn, we are the strong, we burn, again, I'm paraphrasing, we burn brightly. Surah choshech hala shor, Surah mipnei haor, and what they're doing, what they're physically doing with their bodies and giving their lives to do is to dispel the darkest of darkness in this world and replace it with light. And so our tefillah is always with them. That is where our thoughts always are. That is where they should always remain. And God willing, just like God brought us back to this land where we could simultaneously be proud of our religion and proud of our ability to defend ourselves, may Hashem continue to do miracles in our day. And may the soldiers stay safe and may they be successful. And may we really replace the light that has been extinguished in this world. And may we experience only a Chag Urim Sameach.
Anybody have any questions?
Just going to open it up so I can see everybody.
There you go. Well, that was really a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. Oh, you're muted. Can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
Ah, there you go. I didn't need to mute myself. All right. I am wishing everyone a Hanukkah Sameach.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, it was beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks, guys.